At last, a voice for the people who pay big government's bills, not the people who make big government's bills. You're listening to Speaking of Taxpayers here on Gimme Radio, sponsored by the 362,000-member National Taxpayers Union. I'm your co-host, Pete Sepp.
And this is Rachel Slobodian.
Welcome to this week's edition. And I have a chorus of hallelujahs on this wonderful, fine Sunday. It is wonderful and fine because at last I have a co-host once again, the great Rachel Slobodian, who is Communications Manager for the National Taxpayers Union. That means she assists me as well as the entire organization in getting the message out for limited government, lower taxes, and less wasteful spending. So a very special welcome to Rachel. I know she's going to do a great job and is going to have a long career here if she wants it and if she can stand us. A lot is about to happen in the U.S. Congress in the coming week or two. Probably the health care debate will continue. The main legislation, H.R. 3200 in the House of Representatives, has a number of features to it that ought to alarm taxpayers. One of them, the fact that if employers don't wish to offer a minimum level of coverage mandated by the government, they must pay an 8% tax to cover their employees in something called the public option. That is a government-subsidized, government-funded set of mandated health insurance coverage policies. If individuals don't want to purchase insurance meeting a minimum level of federal mandates and coverage, they must pay a 2.5% tax in order to participate in this public option plan. So there's coercion involved right away in H.R. 3200. There are also many more higher taxes, surtaxes on wealthier individuals ranging from 1% to 5.4%, will push the combined total state and federal tax rate on incomes to above 60% in some areas, especially out in California. That's worse than the tax rate in the People's Republic of China. As we've pointed out before, there are many, many other concerns for taxpayers to have, chiefly that the cost of the legislation could get well out of control, far more than what the sponsors are claiming. The sponsors are saying, well, the expenditure will be about $1 trillion from the federal side over 10 years. Others are estimating $1.6 trillion. We believe that even the $1.6 trillion is dramatically below what will actually happen. If you take a look at the history of Medicare over its first 25 years, the actuaries of the program projected that by the year 1990, the 25th anniversary of Medicare, expenditures would be in the neighborhood of $11 billion a year. Instead, it was $110 billion, a 900% cost overrun. Imagine if we have a horrible overrun like that with this health care program. That would mean that the healthcare reform legislation alone would double the national debt in the space of a decade, not counting the cap and trade schemes, not counting other federal spending, not counting any initiatives that the president may unveil in the future. That ought to scare the devil out of all of us. And your National Taxpayers Union is ready to stand with the consumers and the taxpayers of America in opposing this legislation and working for reforms that might actually make health insurance more affordable and more accessible for individuals. Among those is a proposal originally drafted by Congressman John Shadegg. It would allow people to purchase health insurance policies across state lines. What does that do for consumers? Well, think of it as your car insurance. Because you can purchase car insurance policies across state lines, you have a wider availability of choices, you have fewer burdensome mandates, you have competition among insurance companies for your business on a scale that is unseen in the health insurance industry. There are also tax policies that can be changed, especially for the self-employed, who, while they can deduct health insurance premiums against their income tax, still can't do it against that awful 15.3% self-employment tax. If you've read your local newspaper over the past 2 weeks, you may very well have seen a syndicated column by DeRoy Murdoch of the Scripps Howard News Service. And in there, NTU and its ideas about tax policy and healthcare are prominently mentioned. I heartily recommend you get a copy of DeRoy's article. If you didn't see it in your local paper, just type in DeRoymurdock and the word health and Google, and you'll get an online version of that article. Very good reading. Now, Rachel, in your previous professional incarnation, you had experience as a press secretary and a scheduler on Capitol Hill. Have any of your colleagues who are still on Capitol Hill had any comments to you about the level of public outrage that they're hearing by telephone and by email and the like over these healthcare and cap and trade plans?
Well, I tell you what, as most people that are familiar with Capitol Hill structure know, everyone has to start as an intern or staff assistant, which basically means they get coffee, answer phones, and make copies. And I still have some friends who have graduated and are working in that role as staff assistant, talk about how their ears just burn at the end of the day because the amount of phone calls they're picking up from just completely outraged constituents. You can even track, what's happening in the town halls when the members of Congress come home and the response they've gotten. I know in my home state of Arkansas, it certainly hasn't been a welcome home, but more of what are you doing in Washington and why are you choosing to waste our money like this?
Outstanding. So this kind of input really can make a difference. We always tend to brush aside the recommendation at the end of virtually every political talk show. Well, folks, you've got to write or call your congressman. And you can almost hear the listeners on the other end groaning, oh, is that what they want me to do? That won't make any difference. But you're contending that it really can make a difference here.
It certainly makes a difference. I mean, yes, it irritates Capitol Hill staffers, but congressmen listen. They understand and know that, a ton of constituents are calling in. They understand that that's where the staff members are spending their time. And they come forward to leadership and explain their frustration with what leadership is doing and how it's upsetting the constituents. And then that causes a change. So certainly, as constituents, you should never feel like your voice is not heard, but it's just a matter of coordinating and working together so that we come in a united front against the waste of the government.
Well, excellent, excellent. And folks, some of you may have been either watching on TV or attending in person some of these town hall meetings that members of the House and Senate have been holding during the month of August. Many mainstream media commentators are branding those who have some concerns about this healthcare plan as extremists or plants or people associated with brass tops manipulated by big business rather than grassroots. These charges are truly incredible to me because I have heard from NTU members across the country who have decided to attend these meetings, and their own lawmakers have interest ranging from just a totally snide attitude to a very open-minded attitude toward the concerns. The important thing to remember, folks, is don't be dissuaded by lawmakers or people in the White House who say that you're uninformed or that you're exaggerating or that you're overreacting to the provisions in H.R. 3200, because there are facts about this legislation that ought to scare us. There are notable numbers coming out of official government sources about costs, about what will be added to the national debt, about new taxes, about whether the health care plan will actually increase access to insurance in a significant way, whether there are alternatives to creating a government option that could eventually crowd out a lot of private insurers. All of these things are being made available on our website at NTU, our initials for National Taxpayers Union, NTU.org. So again, don't be discouraged, don't be cowed, don't be intimidated. We have facts, not exaggeration, on our side. So visit our website at NTU.org. In this segment, we will discuss Cash for Clunkers, that program that passed in the $787 billion stimulus bill earlier this year. basically paying people to trade in their older, lower mileage cars for something in a higher mileage alternative. It is touted as a green program, in other words, a way to get people to move into fuel-saving automobiles. The ulterior motive? To help automobile manufacturers pad their bottom lines. Automobile manufacturers, as you know, have been in very serious trouble. At least several of them have. Chiefly among them, General Motors, now called Government Motors, because the federal government owns the largest block of shares in General Motors, and there's no sign anytime soon of that situation changing. And this brings us to the point of this segment, namely that the Cash for Clunkers program, advertised with a price tag of $3 billion with a B dollars, is actually quite a bit more expensive. As a recent National Taxpayers Union analysis found, when you start including the costs of the government bailout of General Motors and Chrysler, you realize that it's a far greater cost to taxpayers than the $3,500 to $4,500 advertised as a benefit for turning in a clunker. Is that not right, Rachel?
That's correct. Not only that, but there's a matter of dealerships not receiving timely reimbursements from the government. There was just recently an article from a dealership in South Dakota that said that they had sold over 1,000 but had only been reimbursed for about 200. And then someone else had sold 272 and was only received reimbursement for 27 of them. So that means that the 10-day promise of repayment by the government isn't being adhered to.
Yet another broken promise from the federal government. That's a big surprise. Another bureaucratically run program doling out money. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some attempts at fraud here on the parts of unscrupulous dealers around the country. Certainly not in this example. They're simply waiting for Uncle Sam to get off his rather heavy bureaucratic duff and shovel the money out from Washington, D.C. But there's obviously plenty of room for papers to be possibly forged, for, say, a taxpayer wanting to claim the cash for his clunker, paying a little money under the table to the dealer, who would in turn say, oh yes, indeed, he did buy this particular model of automobile, and he does qualify for cash for clunkers even if he won't. It's very difficult, unfortunately, for the federal government to keep decent enough records to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse from occurring. That's why combined Medicare and Medicaid have an improper payment rate of something on the order of $90 billion a year. Imagine that. $90 billion a year lost to improper payments, according to the Government Accountability Office, from just two of the federal government's health care programs. Imagine if there's a fraud rate like that in this Cash for Clunkers program. Not as much money, but still probably several $100 million. Truly a sad situation, folks. Wouldn't you agree?
Most definitely, but it's just more reason that folks need to write and call their representatives and complain and make sure that we as citizens are holding our elected officials accountable for their actions and the laws that they've enacted.
Yeah, and don't forget, folks, that this Cash for Clunkers program was funded with borrowed money. And you know what that means. The long-term economic impact could be nil or negative from this program. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office issued a report shortly after passage of the $787 billion stimulus package saying that there might be a small positive effect on the economy and job creation for the first 2 years of the plan, but in the out years, the fact that all the money for the plan was borrowed would crowd out the ability of businesses to provide capital and borrow money for their own expansion. So the net impact in the so-called out years would be negative. Jobs might not be created. Jobs might actually be lost. That is a consequence when Washington, D.C. decides to spend money out of an empty pocket. And in this segment, we have one of your favorites and mine, the outrage of the week. It's almost impossible, folks, to narrow down the choices of wasteful government spending to report on here on Speaking of Taxpayers. But I think we have an interesting one this week. It's called Busting the Trust. By trust, I mean the so-called Highway Trust Fund. That is a federal government accounting device that supposedly keeps track of fuel tax receipts and other motor tax receipts and the expenditures being made on behalf of roads and highways. Well, as with just about anything in Washington, D.C., words don't always have the same meaning that they do in the rest of the world. The Highway Trust Fund, unfortunately, is going broke. There's something on the order of a $7 billion shortfall between receipts to the fund and expenditures that are expected to be made. Now, in the end, the federal government can play all the accounting gimmicks it wants with these trust funds. That's why Medicare and Social Security are in such bad shape. But let's grant them the fiction that there is indeed a trust fund device in the first place. Well, it turns out that despite a $7 billion shortfall, a total of roughly $80 billion has been doled out from the Highway Trust Fund over the past number of years on projects that have nothing to do with keeping the country's roads in shape. $78 billion, more than 10 times the shortfall, has been frittered away. Frittered away on what, you may ask? How about 5,547 pedestrian walkways and bike paths? Now, I've got nothing against walking. I walk more than 3 miles every day. Got nothing against bike riding. But these taxes on gasoline and other items were collected in order to keep the roads working and in good condition, not to build new bicycle paths and footpaths. That's primarily a local government function, if it's a government function at all. And one of these bike paths, actually, in a Minnesota town costs more than $1,000 per resident. There's a $2 million bike lane on a Pennsylvania road that the road itself is crumbling so badly, officials there say they may have to drive where the new bike path is going to be. Now, doesn't that sound kind of bizarre, Rachel, that a bike path might become the car path because there's not enough money to fix the roads the cars go on?
That's pretty laughable, but it's certainly not a surprise in terms of what the government has planned and has done in previous times. I was even reading last week about how in one city in Arizona, instead of rehabbing a bridge that actual cars go over, there was a creation of a bridge so that wildlife could pass over. So an actual overpass for wildlife, as opposed to rehabilitating the roads and bridges that are so terribly needed. And we wonder why it's not being accomplished, because it's being spent on things like bike paths and other cockamamie ideas that the government thinks are somehow justifiable, instead of using it on things that will actually help our infrastructure and country.
Cockamamie indeed. Building an overpass for, I don't know, armadillos, road runners? Who knows what's out there in the Southwest? But there are a lot of motorists too, and they're getting the short end of the stick. And so they are with other things like historic preservation efforts on transportation sites, purchase of historic scenic easements, and archaeological research. Archaeological research into highway and road transportation. I mean, when you think of the fact that the U.S. interstate highway system was built during Eisenhower's tenure, what kind of archaeology is there to discover here? But nonetheless, we're talking about $200 million of expenditures on those things alone. Pretty bizarre, and that's why this is the outrage of the week. It's been said that members of Congress can engage in all kinds of activities, but the only one that really counts is their voting. Is that really true, however? Can members of Congress, through the mere advocacy of legislation, change the dynamic and make the overall trend towards spending worse or better? Fortunately, the research and education arm of the National Taxpayers Union provides some concrete evidence that sponsorships and co-sponsorships of legislation do indeed matter. That's because the bill tally system, invented by National Taxpayers Union Foundation, has been tracking legislative sponsorships and co-sponsorships since 1991. What this system does is assign a running cost tally to every single piece of major spending legislation introduced in Congress. And by major, we've set the threshold very low, $1 million with an M dollars or more. In an age where billions now even seem to be a pittance, that means we have a whole lot of legislation that we cost out every year using very neutral costing methods. By neutral methods, we mean the Congressional Budget Office estimates, Office of Management and Budget estimates, the sponsors' own estimates if they are credible, and other third-party sources. We use all of these to put an exact price tag on the things that members of Congress are introducing in the form of legislation. And what do the results show for the most recent Congress? Well, they're not very encouraging. First, let's talk about one record that was set in the 110th Congress. During that time, those 2 years, 2007 and 2008, more bills were introduced and scored, in other words, having a cost, than ever before in the history of the bill tally system. And again, folks, we're talking about almost 18 years here, and the number of bills having some kind of impact on taxpayers reached 2,760 in the previous Congress. Can you imagine nearly 2,800 different pieces of legislation that would extract money from taxpayers' wallets or perhaps even save them a little? Well, that brings me to another point. What is the ratio of the number of bills that would increase spending to the number of bills that would decrease spending? Most listeners to this podcast would probably say, gosh, that's got to be a pretty terrible ratio. Members of Congress are always introducing things that take more of my money rather than give it back. Well, redcounty.com listeners, you are absolutely right, but you will be amazed. Out of the 2,760 pieces of legislation introduced in the 110th Congress that would affect taxpayers, only 105 of those bills would reduce federal spending in one way or another. Think about the ratio in the United States Senate. The ratio of increased bills to cut bills was 30-1. In the House of Representatives, the ratio was 23 bills to boost federal spending for every single bill that would actually reduce federal spending. I would contend that with such horrible ratios, the overall work product of the 110th Congress, or any Congress for that matter, seems to never be geared toward the interest of taxpayers. There was a point in time, immediately after the so-called Republican Revolution, when bill introduction rates for spending cuts actually was pretty good. In the 104th Congress, the first Congress in which Republicans had control for a very long time, there were a total of 1.7 bills to increase federal spending versus those to decrease it. The closest thing we ever saw in the history of bill tally to a near neutral average, where lawmakers were working about as hard to cut federal spending as they were to increase federal spending. In the Senate, also the 104th Congress, the ratio of increases to cuts was about 2-1. It's pretty sad of a commentary, is it not, that a 2-1 ratio was the best we ever could have seen in any Congress in terms of their effort to reduce or control federal spending. Pretty terrible. But now we are dealing with absolutely astronomical ratios of 30-1 in the Senate and 23-1 in the House. How in the world can we expect anything to be passed from Congress and signed into law by the president that would actually help taxpayers if the raw material, the legislation itself that keeps getting thrown into the hopper, is so lopsidedly in favor of higher federal spending? Well, the answer is we can't expect any progress. Congress must absolutely begin the task of giving more thought to legislation to control expenditures and actually cut expenditures. Without that raw material, without that product, virtually anything that gets to the floor of the House of Representatives is likely to be injurious to taxpayers. And in this segment, because we're not just here to complain about big government, we're here to actually do something about it, we have our legislative spotlight. And the spotlight is on a great piece of legislation that would address one of the most inequitable tax situations in the federal law today. That is the death tax. It is called officially the estate and inheritance tax, but it really is more like a duty, an imposition, an excise on the act of dying. As Steve Forbes, one of our board members and the publisher of Forbes magazine, noted, there should be no taxation without respiration. But unfortunately, the federal government has not heeded Steve's warning, at least as of yet. Tell us a little more about what this legislation would do, Rachel.
Well, the legislation was introduced by Congressman Kevin Brady, who is a member of the Ways and Means Committee, that's also known as the committee that taxes and it takes your hard-earned money. But he has introduced a bill. It's H.R. 3463, and the official name of that bill is the Death Tax Repeal Permanency Act. And why that's so crucial is because in 2003, when the Bush tax cuts came about, one of the foundations of the Bush tax cut was also to ensure a partial repeal of the death tax. And now it's a matter of making sure that that's permanent. If Congress does not act on this death tax repeal and does not make it permanent, then we're looking at a truly dire situation where people's hard-earned money, everything they saved and were thrifty and wise in terms of their savings, will be taxed literally to death.
Pretty incredible situation, folks. Yes, under current law, the death tax will be repealed in its entirety, but only for 1 year, next year. So unless any of you out there have an actual plan to die in 2010, your heirs will indeed be liable for this tax. But here's why this is not necessarily a pipe dream. There is in place currently a very large exemption from the estate tax and a rate of roughly 45%. Now, those rates could very well be ratcheted way downward if we can enlist Senate Democrats to do the job. There is some agreement among moderate to conservative Democrats in the Senate that the estate tax should not be allowed to revert back to its old levels of 55% and a $1 million exemption. It might be somewhere like 35% and a $3.5 million exemption. By putting this bill front and center, we are staking out a position that we want the tax to go away in its entirety. Will we win? Maybe not. But again, by presenting a strong alternative, we are putting down a marker that we will not settle for the status quo. So what is that bill number again, Rachel?
The bill is H.R. 3463, so that means it's a bill that was introduced in the House by Kevin Brady. He's a member from Texas, and he also sits on the Ways and Means Committee. So that means that it has a lot better chance to move forward in the committee because it's represented by a committee member. And I think it's one of the rare times that we actually want Washington to act. I know most of the times you guys out there feel like every time Washington acts, we get further and further trouble and more money goes to Washington. But in this instance, it's actually a positive one that if we can get the Congress to pass this legislation, it will benefit you and your children.
Fantastic, fantastic. So everyone out there, call your member of Congress, tell him or her to sponsor the Death Tax Repeal Permanency Act. Well, that about does it for this edition of Speaking of Taxpayers. Let me just remind listeners in the Washington, D.C. area that the 9/12 March on D.C. is coming up, appropriately enough, on Saturday, September the 12th. Come down to the nation's capital, the Freedom Plaza in Pennsylvania Avenue area in the morning, where we'll begin a march all the way to the west front of the U.S. Capitol to protest big government and to support limited government. You can get all the information you need at our good old website, ntu.org. So in closing, folks, remember, you have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power. And we speak truth to power every week here on Speaking of Taxpayers. I'm Pete